Hello, shalom again, Yochev. Shalom again, Bruno. Glad to be learning with you tonight. All right, everybody. Purim is coming up in just a few weeks, and our teacher, Levi Yitzchak Miberdichev, has a lot to say about Purim. In his books, there's 2 volumes. I'll kind of explain this briefly, where the first volume is all commentary on this Torah portion, and the second are kind of a random assortment of essays and thoughts. So he has lengthy essays about Purim, and I've pulled out just some pieces of what he has to say about this upcoming holiday for us to learn together tonight. So I want to jump right into it by asking this question that he'll ask about the difference between the miracle that happens on Purim and the miracle that happens on Passover. And this is how he frames it. He says, Rashi Parish, and by the way, remember, this is just like a little piece of a very lengthy essay about Purim. So this is just like a little snippet. He says, the Rashi Parish, the Hadar Kiblu, B'mei Achashverosh me'ahavat hanes. He says Rashi teaches that what makes Purim so special is that this is the holiday where the Jews took upon themselves Torah out of love, as opposed to at Mount Sinai, he talks about earlier in this essay, where they took on Torah out of fear. He says this is the holiday where they take on the Torah out of love. But why was this miracle that happened to Mordechai and Esther so important to them? Why did they have so much affection for this miracle? But wasn't it the case that when they left Egypt, they saw the parting of the sea? They saw 10 plagues. Why is it that this miracle, specifically the miracle that happened in the Purim story, why was that so much more important, so much more effective, so moving, so much more emotionally affecting than the miracles they saw leaving Egypt? And hello to Elaine and Steve joining us, my mom joining us in Florida. So glad that you're here too. This is the question. How is it that this is the miracle that they took on the Torah out of love and not the ones in Egypt? This is the question. And so I'm going to jump into the essay. Later on in the essay, he explains this. He says there are 2 kinds of miracles. Achad nisim niglim, ve'echad nisim nistarim. One set of miracles are revealed miracles, and one set are hidden miracles. Nisim niglim hu kriyat yam suf yitziat mitzrayim asher nigle la'in kol nisim v'niflaot shenishtana hatva'im. The kind of revealed miracles. This, he says, is like the parting of the sea. This is the 10 plagues. And after these miracles, it's revealed to everybody that the greatness of these miracles and that nature itself is changed. That's why they're revealed, because it's clear, it's obvious, nature changes. It's something that kind of the classic sense of miraculous here. And there are hidden miracles. As like in the days of Mordechai and Esther. There was no change in the state of nature during this miracle. The miracle itself was within nature. There wasn't a change to it. The miracle happened within the framework of the laws of nature. Adkan Amar Mori v'Rabbi v'hinei hanes asher hu b'shinui tva'im kmo eser makol b'metziat Mitzrayim hatva'im v'nitchafu v'nishtanu. He says, those miracles that happened leaving Egypt, those nature themselves, they changed from their natural state. And with the miracle of Mordechai and Esther, nature did not change at all, as we mentioned earlier. He says, Mori v'Rabbi Dov Ber, he says that he learned from his Rabbi Dov Ber, first disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. Esther. This is the reason why Esther's name is Esther, Shaya Hanes Behester, because the miracle itself was hidden. So now we've seen the difference between the miracle for Passover and the miracles for Mordechai and Esther. And somehow there's some reason why that kind of miracle creates a relationship of love and not a relationship of fear. And this is where he's going to go now in terms of why is it that this miracle itself is so chaviv, he says, so beloved by the people of Israel. He'll say, V'hine, al pi pshuta, ein shayach kokach hayeh hanes gadol. Ki lechen hayeh hanes gadol. He says, but wait a second. We said earlier, our rabbis had a problem saying that this was the holiday where the Israelites, where the Jews took on Torah out of love. Because they said earlier that the miracles in Passover, they were greater. But didn't we just say that this miracle, the fact that it could happen in nature, makes it greater because it's that much more difficult? So he's going to answer this question. He says, Asher me'ahavatam kiblu et haTorah hakadosha kevan shahanes haya bathavim asher ba malchut mechusa. He says, it was out of love in this moment that they took on the Torah, because this miracle was within nature when God's kingship was hidden. Lachen hu nes gadol. Because of that, it was a great miracle. Ki derech mashal hu lemelech. And he'll explain it now in this parable. Now, I'll preface it just by saying that this parable, I think, has so many layers to it. And as we read it, we'll try to unpack it, but I'll invite you to review it yourself, to think about it and to come up with your own conclusions about what it means. He says, imagine a king, Asher ba barov chayalav hu menatzeach et hamilchama, who comes with his army and with all of his strength, and he wins a war. Ein kol kach pele. This is not so wondrous. This is not so remarkable. Kemoshe hamelech ba lefamim v'yar yichidi. This is not as remarkable as a king who goes sometimes into the forest by himself, below kli milchamto, without any of his weapons, v'chaylotav einam imo, and without any of his soldiers, and he is victorious with his own strength. It's also, so he says, we have to think about it like this. You can think about these two miracles with this parable. With the miracles of Passover and Egypt, it's like a king who goes to fight a war, and he has all of his weaponry, and he has all of his soldiers, and he wins. That's not so victorious. He says, but the Purim story, it's like a king who goes into a forest, and it manages to survive there for days on end, just with his own strength. Who goes and is victorious in terms of defeating any danger by himself. And he'll go on. He says, Gam domel melech. It's also similar to a king. Kishaba'in lapal tarin. When it comes to one's castle, to the king's castle, v'ro'im gedulato, and one sees the greatness of the king. V'ha'ech mishartav v'avadav osim r'tzono, u'mefachadim mimenu, u'boshim mipanav. And one sees how all of his servants and are do his will, and they're afraid of him, and they're embarrassed before him because of the king's greatness. Ein kol kach chidush, kmo hamelech b'yar yachidi. This is not new. There's no kind of chidush here in one's emotional state when compared to this king that goes alone into the forest. Ve'einenu lavush bilvushei malchut, who's not dressed in his kingly robes. V'chayalav einam imo, and his soldiers are not with him. Umefachadin umitzbaishim mimenu. Zeh nifla gadol. And yet, his soldiers honor him. And yet, his constituency, those who he rules over, are afraid of him because of his power. But not because of his soldiers and because of his weaponry, but because they trust him, because they know that this person, this king in this parable, has wisdom and strength to be able to, do one's will, do his will on his own, alone, hidden, not using all of the tools at his disposal. Ken hadavar hazeh. So the matter is like this: when God changes nature, and shows God's kingship, which he'll do from the highest heavens with all of his angel armies. This is not exactly wondrous in the same way, he says, because the creator of the world can change things. This is not so surprising. But if he does miracles within nature, and his kingship is hidden, and even though all this, he manages to be victorious. This is like those wondrous things that happened in the days of Mordechai and Esther. And this was seen in the eyes of all Israel to the point where they accepted the Torah. And it was because of this that they took on the Torah out of love. I think this metaphor is very helpful to understand what it means to take on Torah out of fear and out of love. You have on one side a king with his army and all of his weaponry, and he's victorious, and you're afraid of this king, and that is like what the Israelites saw leaving Egypt on their way to Mount Sinai. Of course, they're going to take on the Torah because because God has a lot of power. They're afraid. But then, generations later, they experience God like one experiences the wonder, the wondrous feeling of somebody who can go into a forest and survive there for days on end by themselves. What are the kinds of things that person would learn? What are the kinds of skills necessary? The wisdom, the personal strength, the endurance that person would have to have. And a king like that, this is the kicker here. That king, people would follow out of love to say, my king is able to go alone into a forest and be victorious no matter what he does. He can learn. And by the way, I just want to also remind you that even though we're using masculine pronouns, of course, God is way beyond gender here. But you'll forgive me just because the parable itself is written about a king. But that king, that's a king you follow out of love. And so when the Israelites and when the Jews of the Purim story saw this, when they felt that, that's the connection they felt to God in that moment. Like a king who had just come back from the forest, who they follow out of love because they have complete faith, they have complete trust in that um, in God. Now they have a God that they follow out of love. I also want to mention one other layer of this parable is that this is the the kind of Genesis story of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. Um, who Levi Yitzchak Miberdichev, this is the disciple line he comes from. The Baal Shem Tov is said to have gone out, and when he was a kid, gone out to the forest and spent, days out there on his own successfully. And that's where he learned, that's where he developed his spiritual self. And so when he came back, people started following him and listening to his Torah out of love, not necessarily out of fear. And so when the Kedush HaLevi shares this parable, I believe that's what he has in mind too. Very powerful. There's something very powerful about that image, about somebody, about not just a person, but God going into hiding. And I love the idea that this world is kind of like that forest. That you can imagine God working in that forest, like through us, through people, doing God's will without taking the whole army in to just change nature and do it with all of God's strength. So as we get ready for Purim, this is part of the miracle, which is that miracles happen in nature, and that Purim is about a holiday. Purim is a holiday about following God out of love, and it's trying to connect to God on that level. And when we read the Megillah, we can get close to that experience, hearing this story, feeling like God is working in nature, feeling like we can connect to God from a place of love for this holiday. And then next month, we connect to God from a place of fear. And I say fear in terms of like awe and reverence, not just being afraid. But notice this is the trajectory of the calendar. Really, Passover is the first holiday, according to the Torah. And so it starts with this relationship from God out of love, and it builds all the way to this month. Sorry, it starts with a relationship to God out of fear, out of awe, and then it builds into this month where we relate to God out of love. And this is what we mean when we say, we've talked about a few times about growing one's relationship with God from love, from fear to love. And I personally never exactly understood, what do you mean that you grow from fear to love? But actually the calendar itself is, explains what this looks like. It's like a king who you follow because you see the power of his army. And then at the end of the calendar, it's like a king who you follow because you see that they've just spent weeks in the forest alone and have survived, and they've managed to be victorious even within nature. So I hope for you that these few weeks can be one of elevation from a relationship to God, maybe, out of awe or reverence, to a relationship of love. Now, Elaine, my mom in Florida, you say quarantine. Do you want to expand a little bit on what you mean in that statement? And by the way, I'll stay on for a little bit for questions if there are any. Mhm. Our own personal forests. Yeah. Here we are surviving on our own. We're going in by ourselves. And how are we going to be like when we come out? That's a great question. Yeah, our own personal forest. I love the image of somebody going into the forest alone. By the way, this is not a plug to just drop everything right now and go into a forest alone. It's very difficult. Do it in the daytime for a little bit before you just drop everything and go now. But I think that's why this parable is so powerful, because it is difficult. It's scary. And so somebody who can do that, you'd really trust them. You would love them. You wouldn't necessarily fear them. That kind of experience grows a kind of affection, not a fear. And I think that's what he's going for here. And that is the God of the Purim story. Okay. Well, everybody, I will wish you a Shavua Tov. Next week, we will learn another text as we get ready for Purim, and with the hope that when Purim comes, we have a deeper connection to it, that when we listen to the Megillah, we're able to think about all these things, to think about what it means that God is hiding, and that through that hiding, we're able to connect to God from a place of love rather than fear. Okay, Shavua Tov, everybody. Oh, Yochev, you had a comment. I'll translate your comment. Hold on, please. Mm-hmm. Yochev, you'll forgive me. My internet is running slower than usual. So just hold on a moment. You say, oh, good. Okay. You said you'll be able to listen to this a little more later, that you weren't able to now. Fantastic. Well, great. Shavua Tov, everybody. Shavua Tov, Bruno, Yochev, my mom, Elaine, and Steve. And I look forward to learning next week. Bye, everybody.